And I'd like the new panel to come up, so thank you guys. I just want to say, I mean, there is a lot of controversial things going on here. We knew that would happen. I think you're going to find other voices throughout the rest of the conference. And I think it's important for us to continue to have these difficult conversations, as Walter was saying and Martha was saying. So let's please try and remember that a lot of this is, as Larry and Martha and others have said, new science, and we're trying to figure it out. So could I please bring up the next panel with which is on soil, water, and environmental impact with Don Huber, Edo McGowan, Alistair Boxall, Arden, and Lindsay Lusher-Shute. Can I get this group up? And aren't you moderating?
I'm the moderator.
Yeah, so why don't you sit over there?
Where would you like me?
You can sit here.
Thank you. Mention to your husband on the vaccines. They use pesticide soap deadness.
Absolutely. And you know, I've been educated on both sides of the fence. Conventional pharmacist, conventional training, but also spent the majority of my career on the holistic and preventative side and on the board of the American Holistic Medical Association and so forth. I think that we can position ourselves to use the best of the knowledge from around the world and not be married to any one thing. But we're foolish if we don't recognize where massive harm is coming to our youngsters and to the future of our humanity. And vaccines is unfortunately one of them. The concept originally was working.
Can we get the panel to come up? Don, you want to take a seat? Edo, you want to take a seat?
To the FDA. 10 years later, wrote a book criticizing and condemning the FDA for already being captured by 1916.
It was. It absolutely was. It's been bought and sold. My father was a pharmacist too, and he said the FDA was bought and sold more times than you could shake a stick. You know, they're the only. Until the CDC, they were the only money-making arm of the federal government because they get a kickback on every prescription that's written.
So look at them. They're supposed to be for public health. They're making money with drug industry.
And they've got huge six-figure jobs waiting for them when they roll off.
It's a revolving door.
Kids, college education being paid for. There's no. It is absolutely overreach. All right. It's scandalous.
I'd like to talk to you later.
I've got to go.
Hello,
Yes, good.
hello. Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm Gabriel Brown. This is Professor of Biology here.
I have a short.
Okay, perfect. I will just start talking a little bit and we'll start the introduction as soon as you arrive. Hi, everyone. I would like to bring your attention back to the symposium. Let's wrap up in 5 seconds so you can finish your sentence. I know there's a lot of food for thought here. All right, so welcome back to the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities Symposium on the Microbiome. For all of you who are still here, I would like to remind you, this is not a scientific conference, right? It's a center for the humanities and politics. So many of the opinions that are expressed, they are actually personal opinions, informed with the facts that we all have. I think that's what we're here to talk about, how we generate facts and knowledge and information. But remember that it's not necessarily a scientific consensus that's being discussed here, right? So it's people bringing different elements to the table. So encourage your questions. And one thing that's important as an educator of young people, not to be patronizing. I would like just to remind you that very often we forget that science can have this intimidating factor on people as well. People think they're not experts. People think they can't ask questions, but it is not true. And it's our responsibility as citizens to actually question science, because let's be honest, most of the science, even in industry, very often is publicly funded, right? So it's funded by our tax money, by us. So we define how science is done. We define what actually becomes knowledge or not. So please be a part of, take a responsibility and be part of the knowledge and science that we do here. Just to kind of complete the conversation, I was asked to remind everyone that yes, we talk a lot about economics here. Industries, lobbies have a lot to do, but there are other models to remember as well in the world. With universal healthcare, and the lobbies and the money can be a little different in how it's being used as well, and defining and shaping questions. So I think it's a good idea to think in the interest of what the Hannah Arendt Center has been doing, think globally as well, and think about other models and how things are being done when we attack these questions. So without further ado, I would just like to introduce you to this next session. It's about soil environment. So earlier you had the chance to learn a lot about microbiome. I'm sure you have lots of questions. Now is the time to be, but why are we talking about the environment? We're talking about microbiome. We're talking about health. What does the environment have to do with that? I think you probably have lots of questions. It's been mentioned a few times before. So now is the time to start discussing things, start thinking and exploring many ideas. So I would like to encourage our next panelists. I'm Gabriel Perron. I will be your moderator. I would like to ask our next panelists to introduce themselves briefly, tell them what they do. And if they would like to share with us maybe one of a personal event of awakeness that actually led them to do this kind of research and be involved in this field as we speak today. All right, thank you. Yeah, please.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Alistair Boxall. I'm from the University of York in the UK. I'm a little tired, so I arrived at 11 o'clock last night, so might not be completely switched on. So I'm actually an environmental chemist, and I've been studying chemicals in the environment pretty much for about 30 years now. And about 20 years ago, I started looking at veterinary antibiotics, and since then I've been looking at antibiotics in soils, in waters, and really sort of trying to understand how they cycle around the environment, how they get back into food and into water and back into the humans and the animals, and also more recently thinking about what the implications of antibiotics in the environment are for resistance and the AMR problem.
Don Huber, Emeritus Professor of Plant Pathology at Purdue University. My 55 years in academia has been looking at microbial ecology and studying soil-borne diseases. For soil-borne diseases, we have very few chemicals, so that we look at that management aspect and the interaction between the environment. Have a dual career. Don't talk very much about the other aspect, but for 42 years, a few days short of that, I served in the Department of Defense, various capacities. 38 years would be as a medical intelligence analyst, chemical and biological warfare, where we also looked at the strategic intelligence involved in epidemics around the world. And when we would see something change, we would ask the question, what changed? Why are we seeing this disease that's always been fairly stable, fairly predictable, all of a sudden violating all of the rules that we had established for that particular situation? And so we would ask, what's changed? I've served on the Surgeon General's Epidemiology Committee, Global Quadripartite Committee. I retired as Associate Director of the Armed Forces Medical Intelligence Center, now the National Medical Intelligence Center. So that that was a very compatible relationship with my study of microbial ecology for the soil-borne pathogens, because you look at those systems and you say, when something changes, you have to say, what changed? And then you start looking at all of those interactions, because when we're farming, we're managing an ecology. When we're eating, we're managing an ecology. You can't change one thing without changing everything else in that system. And so my approach in understanding many of the changes that we've seen in my generation, and in the later part of my generation, the last 35 or 40 years, dramatic changes in health in our soil, the health of our crops, the health of our animals, and human health. And so I've asked that question, what's changed in that process? As a result, probably have a little different insight than many others who've studied some of those aspects. But I've realized how closely integrated life is, and how important it is that we understand those integrations. And we've talked about this morning some of the changes or some of the new tools that we have with molecular techniques, tremendous tools for us. We have a little tool that I've really enjoyed and had been a tremendous help to me in my international consulting, and that's a tool that we can measure now. In 30 seconds, I can tell you what the nutrient content, mineral content is, anything on the periodic table from sodium to uranium. I can get that in 30 seconds in a liquid, in a dry form, in a wet leaf. It's an X-ray spectroscopy, but it's in a little 10-pound instrument now rather than the $5 billion synchrotron at Brookhaven or at Argonne that started on in understanding that pathogenesis and disease development. So a little bit of background there, and we can get on to more, but certainly the impact then of the genetically engineered crops and the glyphosate antibiotic that we indiscriminately apply everywhere at about the tune of 500 million pounds a year. In the United States, you compare that to the 29 million pounds of penicillin or tetracycline or cephalosporins, all of the other antibiotics, and yet this one antibiotic that we refer to as an herbicide because it's a very strong mineral chelator to tie up critical minerals, but very few people are concerned about the antibiotic activity that challenges and changes the microbiome on the leaf surface, the microbiome in your gut, and the microbiome in the soil that we're all dealing with. And when we look at that, and I look at the changes that we've seen, serve on our Threat Pathogens Committee, more than 40 plant diseases used to be managed very well that we now refer to as re-emerging diseases, threatening the sustainability of many of our agricultural crops. And you ask the question, what's changed? And it comes back, this very simple compound and those factors that have encouraged its indiscriminate use. All comes back in that area. We can look at 34 human chronic diseases that are now reaching epidemic proportions that I would study from a chemical and a biological warfare potential, from a strategic standpoint. Tremendous impact when you have 70% of your population that can't pass a recruitment exam for the military because of deteriorating health. And so we discuss those aspects there.
My name is Lindsay Lusher-Shute, and I am not a scientist. I work on policy. For about the last 15 years, I've worked on local, city, state, and federal policy. I founded a group called the National Young Farmers Coalition with a couple of local farmers here about 10 years ago, and through that worked on two farm bills. So I have a good perspective, I think, on how information from conversations like these today actually work their way into law and regulation and some of the problems therein. My husband and I, Ben is going to speak on the next panel, also have a farm, Hardy Roots Community Farm. It's about 10 minutes from here. Some of you may have eaten our produce. And I also have perspective from the farmer, from the marketplace, as to when you are trying to be a force for good in this system, the challenges therein.
So a little more on my ag background. I was raised on a dairy farm in Michigan, and one of the things that I understood was back in the 1960s, we were already seeing herbicide-resistant weeds. And I remember Michigan State University saying, and our extension service saying that's impossible, that doesn't happen. But we were seeing that. And my father began using antibody whey products in the dairy herd rather than using antibiotics. We could get by with less than one bottle of Combiotic in the entire dairy operation a year. And so that was my introduction. When I went to the University of Arizona, I took a dairy science class, and I couldn't believe my ears that the professor was telling me all of these diseases that dairy herds were encountering, because we didn't see that on our farm. And they said, oh no, this is automatic. You're going to have all of these things. And so I read a book called The Farmer Wants to Know, written by Dan Scow and Carrie Reams, and it was the first book I ever read that actually gave an answer as to why do we have weeds, diseases, and insects. And they're not there because we have a deficiency of pesticides. They're not there because, insects like to eat everything. I then had the opportunity to spend time with Dr. Philip Callahan, and I'd recommend you read all of his books. He was an entomologist at the University of Florida who proved that the antenna that insects have is not just there for a hat rack. It's actually there because the insects get the infrared, ultraviolet, and radio wave frequencies off from their prey and their food and their mates. That's how they find their food. And the difference in the nutrient density, the nutrient makeup of the crop determines what that signal is that the insects tune into. And he proved, along then with a guy by the name of Chabosa, who was a French biologist, insects only attack sick plants. They do not attack healthy plants. And you say, oh, well, that's impossible because we know if you grow a monocrop of corn out there, the insects are going to come in there and eat that. Yeah, they do. But only because those crops are not fit for us to eat. That's how the insect system operates. Now, Phil Callahan's work was poo-pooed by the entomology industry. And still today, if you go to the University of Florida and you go to the entomology department, they will say Phil Callahan was a quack. Yes, but the Department of Defense funded all of his research and classified it until after he retired, and it was the research that developed the cloaking devices for our attack helicopters. That's physics. And I understood that actually does happen in the field. And as Dr. Huber will talk about, You get rid of insects by changing the nutrition. We don't have to use an organic pesticide ultimately to solve that. Maybe in the interim we do. But what we need to understand, and what put together for me why I needed to go to medical school, was because that's the same in humans. It starts in the soil. You change the nutrition in the soil. You address all of the weed issues. Weeds are not there just because. They're there because of the dynamics of the soil, not because they're all the same. The same thing with the insects, the same thing with all of the pathogens. And so we put that together, and when we change the nutrition, we change the outcome. We have the technology today, we have the capability with the plants we have, we don't need GMOs, to more than feed 2 to 3 times the world population. Oh, you already have one.
I'm Ed McGowan. I'm basically a policy analyst. I've been trained in medicine, and I've been trained in water and a lot of other things, but my main function is to look at a governmental agency and determine if it's solid or been bought up by industry. And that's basically where I'll be coming from in this. And so I've taken that with me through being the environmental officer for about half of Africa with 22 countries under my purview, to look at different governmental agencies, how they behave, how their regulatory agencies behave, what they accomplish, and like Dr. Hoover, what is changed, what is different, what drove that difference, how does that then affect the policies, how does that then affect what they do? How then does that affect you because of what they do not do? So that's where I'm coming from on this. So my function here is to ask questions, not necessarily to give you a lot of information.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. As you see, we have a range of panelists here. So maybe to put things in perspective and try to make the link between microbiome health and environment, I would like to ask our panelists to maybe describe what they think is the biggest challenge or threat to our health from an environmental perspective, and maybe also like focusing on your own area of expertise, so that maybe we have a range of different aspects that relates to health and the environment together, if that's okay.
Okay, let me start that. The people who are determining how the public policy is delivered to you, how the crop is delivered to you, how the medicine is delivered to you, how the water is delivered to you, are all regulatory agencies. These become clientele captured, which means that the people they regulate basically are pushing on them more than you are, because you are busy doing other things. So you probably don't know who your water agency is, or who's checking your food, or if it's even being checked. But the industry that is being controlled by this agency is intimately involved with that agency every day. And so pretty soon the agency sees themselves as the servant to that industry, not you. And as a consequence of this, there's this shift. And so what's not there is why the agency was established in the first place, which is to protect you, the public. I mean, after all, that's where your tax dollars are going. So your tax dollars are going into that, but they're being misspent because the agency that is to regulate whatever it is to regulate is not looking at that thing called you, the public. And so you get this warped thing that is happening, and you cannot, for example, seem to break through that. They get very entrenched in their job protecting industry. And we'll hear probably a lot of that if you take that lens and put it over what these other panel members are going to say. you can draw back to that point. That's all I'm going to say for now.
I just wanted to expand on that a bit. When you say you, looking after you, I think the regulators are very bad at looking at the complexity of a system. And for instance, glyphosate, there's a lot of conversation right now, is it carcinogenic or not, but not about necessarily how does it impact the microbiome. There's just not, unless they're told to think of all of these issues together in a holistic way, which generally they're not, that the system doesn't work well with complexity, it's difficult for a regulator, unless they're given that directive, they will not be looking at a whole system, or even that whole system has to be defined in statutory language to be able to pursue it as an objective. And that is a significant limitation in policy.
So from what I see in teaching ag courses around the world is that things are not really any different just because you cross a border. It's interesting to me how when I took a course at Michigan State, I took a summer potato growing course. And it was interesting to me that the professors at Michigan State, because we grow a lot of potatoes in Michigan, but they're grown in sandy, light ground. And the professors there said, oh, it's impossible to grow potatoes in alkaline soils because you're just going to get scab from those. And so you have to have an acid soil. And so you need to drop that pH to somewhere around 5 to 6. And fortunately, I'd gone to university in Arizona. You see, they grow a lot of potatoes in Arizona and California and Idaho, in Australia, all on alkaline soils. How is it possible then that the professors at Michigan State don't understand how to grow potatoes in alkaline soil, yet the majority of potatoes grown in the United States are grown on alkaline soils? It has to do with the biology. Understanding that really it's the biology that determines whether or not you're going to have potato scab. It's the biology that determines what nutrients are going to interfere or promote the growth of those crops. It's the nutrition that really determines whether or not you're going to have compacted soil or you're going to have nice, light, loose, fluffy soil. And it doesn't matter about the cation exchange capacity. It doesn't matter whether you have a sandy soil or heavy clay soil. I've seen soils, everything from literally blow sand in Western Australia to areas of New South Wales that have the heaviest soils anywhere in the world, cation exchange capacities plus 50. And yet they're able to grow crops. And it's because they're addressing a nutritional issue along with a biological issue. And from a farming perspective, from a commercial farming perspective, growing food, it becomes, one, can we do it economically? Two, can we, part of the economic side of it is how much is our input cost versus what do we get out of it? So can we yield enough in order to, one, make a profit, but can we yield enough from a consumer perspective to actually feed you, to feed the population that increased in demand? And what we find is that it's the better farmers around the world that are adopting this understanding of the microbiome in their field as far as growing their crops, how it correlates to weed pressures, how it correlates to insect pressures, how it correlates to disease, and then what they are really interested in, how does it correlate to yield? How does it correlate to the production? There's an organization in California that they used to be called Beyond Organics, and they now have changed their name, but it's a good friend of mine who actually raises tree crops. And they proved side by side in Fresno, California, with 300 acres of tree fruit, stone fruit, primarily apriums, that the production on an organic operation was 4 times what the conventional is. 4 times. And using a refractometer, which is a little device that you use to measure the sugar level in the sap. So if any of you are into wine or something, grapes, you'll understand they use a refractometer to measure the sugar level in the grapes. The higher the Brix reading, B-R-I-X, not B-R-I-C-K-S, B-R-I-X, which is a refractometer reading, the higher the refractometer reading, the higher the nutrient density as a general rule. And as we change nutrition to track that refractometer reading, so goes everything in improvement. The higher the Brix reading, the higher the nutrient density, the higher the yield is going to be, the longer the shelf life is going to be, the better then our health is going to be. And so the most important thing, the most threatening thing that I see is that we have a lot of drift around the world, both in our water and in our air. And if we don't understand that drift problem, and as I know Don talks about a lot, we have to compensate that nutrition for the drift chelation. Glyphosate, for example, or doesn't matter about glyphosate, it can be any of them. They all chelate nutrients out of the system. And so by pulling nutrients out of this, you have to compensate for that. So the farmers that understand this note that not only do they have to put in adequate nutrition for what normally would grow their crop where they want to, but they have to add extra nutrition in order to compensate for the drift of the pesticides. And that's what I see as the biggest problem I see when I teach farmers around the world is just grasping that nutritional concept to everything else out there in their field, the weed, diseases, insects, and their overall yield.
I was just hoping that the scientist here could sort of set the stage for what's happening in the environment right now with pesticide runoff, with what's happening when we're taking antibiotics at home and then that's flowing into streams and rivers, because I think that there's a real lack of understanding, and I feel like I don't even fully grasp the impact of more industrial scale agriculture and modern use of antibiotics on our environment.
Can I say something? What you need to look at is water, irrigation water, and the use of human waste as the source of nutrients, because that's carrying a lot of industrial waste along with it, and it's carrying antibiotics. And so what's coming out of the sewer plants around the nation is going on to the farms. This is going into the crops. You're eating the crops, you're getting that. The question is, how well regulated is that? That's the blind side of the regulatory industry. They don't see it, they don't want to see it, and you're getting it. And so I think this is something that we could discuss.
That's great. And since we're talking about water, maybe I can bring the discussion back to Alistair here a little bit and answer your question.
Yeah, so hopefully I can answer your question. So I think your question was, what would I be most concerned about in terms of sort of soil and water and the microbiome? And I think the thing that worries me most at the moment is the antibiotics and other chemicals that we use that we know are toxic to microbes. So there's a lot of evidence that now that heavy metals are contributing to resistance in the environment, and then a lot of the molecules that are used as surfactants are also selecting for resistance. So we're overusing these molecules. We're putting them into the environment, and I have actually got some slides. So Roger said it was all by dialogue, but he did say that he would allow us free slides. So I've prepared 3 slides just to give you a feel for what I do around antibiotics in the environment and also where I see that the risks are. So so I guess this whole area kicked off about 20 years ago. So the late 1990s, scientists actually in Germany began to make the link between the drugs that we use as individuals, but also we use in agriculture, and the potential for those then to be excreted, either to treatment systems or emitted to soils, and then be transported to surface waters. And then in 2002, there was a really big study in the States. It was done by the US Geological Survey, and they went and monitored 139 sites across the US. And they looked for antibiotics and also a lot of other molecules. And I guess we shouldn't really have been surprised by the results, but they found them. So pretty much every river they looked at, they found antibiotics. And that shouldn't be surprising because we as a society are taking these molecules, we're excreting them, we're linked to the environment, and then we're emitting them into the environment. And since that paper in 2002 by the USGS, the whole area has rocketed. So there's studies all around the world now. And I think, we're beginning to realize that the natural environment is really important in terms of the antimicrobial resistance crisis. Resistance is a natural thing. It occurs in the environment. But I think the way we're polluting the environment is elevating levels of resistance, and it's basically increasing the probability that we as individuals, as animals or humans are going to be exposed to the resistance. But if you look at the data, all of the work at the moment is really being done in Europe and North America, certainly in terms of antibiotics in the environment. So what we've been doing over the last 2 years is trying to correct that. And we've been running this study. So this is the Global Pharmaceuticals Monitoring Study, where we've been trying to look at concentrations of antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals across the world. We're now at a stage where we're monitoring 101 countries. So it's about 200 rivers in 101 countries. We're looking for 61 molecules. So this includes antibiotics. We've got about 13 antibiotics in the suite. And we're beginning to get a feel now for what the exposure is across the world. So if we move on to the next slide, this is basically what we're finding. So in terms of the antibiotics, like the USGS survey, we detect antibiotics everywhere in river waters. So about 65% of the samples that we monitor, we see at least one antibiotic. And many of those samples, you'll see all of the antibiotics pretty much that we're monitoring. What we can also do with this data is we can compare it to sort of so-called safe values. So recently, the industry have developed values that they think, if they occur in the environment, won't select for resistance, and we can compare our concentrations with that. Now, you could debate how well these values work, but it gives us a start. And we find of the sites we look at, probably about 1 in 7 actually have at least one antibiotic above that safe level. At one site, it was 300 times, one antibiotic was 300 times more concentrated than the safe value, which I think is quite scary. The other thing you can see is that from this graph, if you look at the colours, while we do have problems in North America and also Europe, the problems are much more acute elsewhere. So we see the really, really high levels in rivers in Asia and Africa. And if we move to the next slide, these are just a few pictures of some of the really nasty sites where we're seeing very, very high antibiotic levels. So the top left, that's a site in Bangladesh. This was a site where one drug was 300 times above the safe level. And we've done some work on this site now, and we think that's from drug manufacturing. So there's manufacturing happening in that area, and basically the effluent's just going straight out into the river system. If you go to the top right, that's a site in Ghana, and you can see in the foreground you've basically got a waste dump. And our feeling is probably what's happening there is you've got unused and waste medicines just being dumped into the dump, and then that's migrating into the system. The bottom left site is a site in Nairobi, so that's in Kenya. Sorry, bottom right is Kenya. And there we saw all sorts of things. We saw just waste dumped along the side of the rivers. We saw septic tank waste being discharged directly from trucks into the river system. And again, just feeding the antibiotics into the environment. And then the last picture is in Israel. So that's actually at the Palestine-Israel border, where what you have is you've got raw sewage coming across from a city in Palestine across the wall, the border, into Israel, and that goes into one of the main river systems in Israel. So while I think we do have issues in Europe and North America, these are the things we need to start fixing if we're going to solve the problem of antimicrobial resistance. We can do everything at home to improve usage, improve stewardship, operate our farms in the way that we've just heard so that we're using less antibiotics. But if we don't fix this, I don't think we'll ever fix the problem. So I'll shut up there.
I think it's important to point out also that the problems in these places of the world very often are linked to our use and how we actually use antibiotics as well, right? So maybe before we just go we open the floor for questions, I was wondering if, Don, you could maybe give us a little bit more background also maybe on chemicals or antibiotics in soil?
Yeah, on the, I guess I'd ask a question, how do you feel when you've been lied to and find out that you've been lied to? And that betrayal of trust came up in 3 court cases in California regarding glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The jury in the last one was finally able to see about 30% of the hard scientific information that's available on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and glyphosate. Their award was $2 billion to the couple that filed the lawsuit. And you say, how do you come to such a conclusion for that value? The value goes well beyond those 2 individuals with only 30% of the actual hard science. The jury gave a unanimous decision, and then you had letters from the jurors written to the judge. Please don't reduce this because this goes much further into the world's population that has been exposed to a lie. And so when we evaluate these chemicals, we also need to understand what they do. The EPA was told this chemical, glyphosate, only inhibits the EPSPS enzyme. We know that it inhibits 191 different enzymes, stimulates 30. But you have to understand what it is. It was first patented as broad-spectrum mineral chelator used to clean steam pipes and boilers. 10 years later, it was patented then by Monsanto as broad-spectrum herbicide because it's a broad-spectrum chelator. Chelator that ties up essential mineral elements. All of our herbicides are chelators. Many of our antibiotics are chelators, farm minerals. That's how they deny or act against the organisms. You have to also then realize that in 2000, glyphosate was patented as a broad-spectrum antibiotic, but it's an antibiotic against the beneficial organisms. Your pathogens and a lot of the negative organisms have over 4,000 times greater tolerance for glyphosate than your beneficial organisms in the soil that fix nitrogen, that make manganese and iron available for plant uptake, that make all of the other, your calcium, magnesium, potassium even, and zinc, cobalt, all of those minerals are tied up by glyphosate, either directly or by its antibiotic activity against the organisms that would normally mineralize and make that available. So that you look at that broad spectrum aspect, the other characteristic of glyphosate that's of concern is that it's a synthetic glycine amino acid that's been demonstrated now to be actually incorporated into proteins to change the function of that protein. And you say, well, what's the impact then? Well, many of our diseases, and I yesterday or day before yesterday received a plant analysis, and the farmer in North Dakota said, can't understand why my mycotoxin levels, my deoxynivalenol, my zearalenone are so high. I have severe ergot problems in my pasture. He said, I can't understand what's going on, and he sent me a plant tissue analysis. Well, his copper is all tied up with excessive molybdenum and iron. Doesn't have any manganese or zinc there. How are you going to have any defense reactions in the plant against all of the pathogens? What's the animal going to be fed? And then you start looking at this antibiotic activity, the herbicidal activity. You can understand why the University of Wisconsin, in their report, in trying to look at eutrophication of Lake Erie, reported that 1/3 of a pound of phosphorus is coming from every acre of tillable land in the watershed for Lake Erie. You say, well, what's that doing? Because they said it's not coming as phosphorus, as phosphate. It's coming as glyphosate. 1/3 of a pound per year of a very highly water-soluble, persistent antibiotic and herbicide, but it's an herbicide that is active against all of the competitors for the blue-green algae, so that the blue-green algae is actually stimulated. One of the few organisms that can actually use it as a nutrient source. So you have all the eutrophication then coming about. You have the red algae blooms with the toxins. We've changed the entire biology with the indiscriminate use of glyphosate at that 500 million pounds a year. We have 2 farmers from Colorado that are serving jail term for food adulteration. They were growing cantaloupes, sold them. 6 people died from listeria. Well, where'd the listeria come from? FDA's evaluation couldn't find anything they were doing wrong. They only had 1 piece of old equipment. Everything else was brand new. But the biology, the biome, microbiome of those plants had been decimated by the glyphosate that is indiscriminately used all over the area, both from a drift standpoint as well as a direct application. And your competitors, your bacillus and your pseudomonas and all of those organisms that would normally eliminate the listerias and E. coli, those other pathogens that we're concerned about now in lettuce and eggs and many of our other foods, no longer have that natural biological control because it's all sensitive to this antibiotic that we call glyphosate. And so we've changed the microbiome. You know, the first session said, well, how big do we have to think? And we have to think really large when you're applying 5 or 6 billion pounds worldwide of this antibiotic and mineral chelators. It's going to impact everything that you do that you hold dear, because when it gets into your GI tract as a contaminant in your food, and the EPA says you can have up to 4,000 times more glyphosate in your water, and that's perfectly safe, then what Dr. Monica Kruger at Leipzig University says is enough to shut down your GI tract as far as give you gut dysbiosis. Well, 16 of these human chronic diseases that we're seeing now reaching epidemic proportions are from gut dysbiosis. And you say, well, how? Well, all of these microbiomes are all being challenged and changed by our practices there. So that we see the decimation of the sick soil, we see the sick crops, we see the sick animals, and the tremendous impact now on our own health and that. So it's a very broad spectrum because of the indiscriminate use and the broad spectrum activity of this very unique chemical. It's anticipated it'll be 100 years before a compound comparable to glyphosate will be invented. It's very unique in its broad spectrum activities, but decimating to our system. If I was an adversary looking at from a strategic standpoint, from a military standpoint, wanted something that could weaken a country, on the long term, I couldn't find another chemical that is doing what we're seeing done right now.
Let's not get any ideas with this. So, so what I hear so far is that our use of antibiotics, but also in other chemicals, right, either through our own personal use, but also in agriculture, finds their way in the environment, both our water, but our soil, at actually unprecedented concentrations. And the consequences out here are both for the environment, right? So like potentially like disturbance in the environment, increasing the presence of maybe toxic and organisms like blue-green algae. We also seem to think about the increase of infectious disease in our water. So like contact with the water could increase infections. And lastly, what I hear is also maybe the link back to the microbiome is that even the exposure to those chemicals seems to also impact our own microbiome and potentially link to the health consequences we've talked about earlier today. So hopefully that gives us some background to open the floor for some questions. I think I already see a few hands. I think earlier, there's a nice gentleman that actually had a question, so why don't we go there first? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Next to you, Emily, here.
Alistair, can you touch briefly on, if you can speak to any of the sociocultural factors that in the bluer areas, what makes them so different? Australia, Japan, Canada? Yeah,
okay. So there's a whole range of drivers. If you take Australia, for example, a lot of so the study had a very urban focus. We did look at some ag areas. But if you look at Australia, most of the cities and towns are actually on the coast. So the wastewater, there's not a great deal of wastewater actually going directly into the rivers. It tends to go out to sea. So when we looked at New Zealand, for example, it was really difficult to find a river in New Zealand that had a wastewater discharge going into the river. So it doesn't happen. The exposure's happening elsewhere. Dilution's another factor. So if you've got large dilution, the concentrations go down. So some of the systems we looked at are very, very dry, like Israel. I could have shown you a picture of the stream in Israel, the river in Israel, they call it. I think it's called the Alexander River. And it's just a trickle of water. So that water is almost pure effluent. You haven't, and that's what's forming the river. So, yeah. And then there's the usage practices themselves. So if you go to some of these countries like Kenya and Nairobi, you can go into a corner shop and you can buy whatever antibiotic you want. And the local cultures. We had a PhD student from Egypt. I was sitting with him on the bus one day, and he was taking metronidazole, which is one of it's the drug that we found 300 times above the safe level. And I said, why are you taking that? He said, I have a headache. And I said, well, that isn't going to cure your headache. And he said, but in Egypt, that's what we take when we're feeling a bit down. So you've got these many different drivers. Whereas in the UK, we do overuse antibiotics, but there's a push to lower it. We have to get them onto prescriptions, so that the doctors have to prescribe them. I think also on the veterinary side, we're a lot more tightly regulated than you are in the US. So again, the veterinary practitioners have to prescribe the antibiotic, and we don't use any antibiotics for growth promotion anymore. So there's a whole range of different explanations.
Maybe it seems to be a question in relation to here.
Actually, it's more of a comment.
Please go ahead.
Comment, please. Hi, I'm Laura Kahn. I'm a physician and researcher speaking later today. In regards to your presentation, it was very interesting. I wanted to point out the impact of human and animal waste on the biome of the planet. There's about over 7 billion humans and about 30 billion of their domesticated animals. We make up now about 96 to 98% of the total terrestrial mammalian zoomass on the planet. So we make up most of the mammalian zoomass. There's actually very little wildlife, mammalian wildlife left. And we produce about 4 trillion kilograms of fecal matter every year. And that fecal matter is 80% animal, and most of it has to go somewhere, and a lot of it gets spread onto the soils where it mixes with the soil microbes, contaminating the soil and leaching into the waterways, which contributes to eutrophication and algae production and dead sea life. So we need to figure out what to do with all of this manure. I mean, you can think of 4 trillion kilograms as akin to 1.6 million Olympic-sized swimming pools a year that we are producing every year. And that's a lot. And we are changing the biome of the planet in ways that we just don't really fully understand, but it's certainly contributing to foodborne and waterborne illness. And one last point about Australia and New Zealand. There have been a couple of studies, very interestingly. Australia and New Zealand have some of the highest antibiotic use per capita. And it was surprising, why would that be? But another study, and I'm sorry I don't remember the names, if you email me I'm happy to send you this information, found that countries with the highest animal to human fecal ratio there seemed to be some association with the high antibiotic use. So if you have a very high animal to human fecal ratio, that might be contributing to the soil contamination, water contamination, and then perhaps contributing to antibiotic use. So it's all kind of tied together in a very complicated way. I mean, it's just a loose observation. There hasn't been any studies confirming that, but I think it's something of note that we need to talk a lot more about manure than we are in this whole big issue.
I would like to hear maybe one more question before we come back to our panelists.
Thank you for the question. That's a lot of shit. I mean, quite literally. And my question actually builds off of this. I've been hearing a lot about systems thinking in the first panel, and now in the second one. I'm sure it'll come up again. And we just heard about sociocultural drivers. What can we do practically to manage all of this shit, and then also deal with these sociocultural drivers at the same time while thinking about the microbiome, right? This panel is talking to a very specific crowd of people. And earlier we tried to do the analogy for the children. Don't know how well that went over for the children, but how do we take what we're learning right now and what we're seeing and actually think about Bangladesh and Lake Erie and making sure that we're all on the same page? What are some projects or practical things that we can actually do to deal with these issues?
One of the things that we do with the manure is we require a manure management plan. Tremendous source of nutrients. Concentrated, and that's part of the problem. A lot of our producers used to look at it as a disposal problem rather than as black gold. When we changed that philosophy so that they started using it as a nutrient resource, and we had to do some things to help that, to make it economical for them to transport it further. But we have a large swine producer, finishing producer in Indiana. The one year when the meat prices dropped, he made more off of his manure as a nutrient for his corn crop because he had managed that. He had the plan ready so that he could balance his nutrition. He wasn't dumping all of that phosphorus out in just one area that was tying up his zinc and his manganese and other nutrients, but we were going in with a nitrification inhibitor. We were bombing in about 20 gallons of anhydrous ammonia, bringing the nitrogen level up so that he could drop his P and K levels down to a reasonable level. And in 1 year with corn, he was essentially recovering all of that. There wasn't anything left really to dispose of then. But if they don't do that, they don't want to haul it very far because they haven't looked at it as that nutrient resource. But if you go to the cast paper that we put out, a number of other studies, and most states now have picked up and require that management plan. The question that comes in is when you get into city and industrial sewage, then it gets contaminated with your heavy metals. That's a different story. From the manure standpoint, it depends on what's going in. Now, we had a situation where we had a grower that was using chicken manure. And so, as a fertilizer source, the problem was that when we analyzed that for glyphosate, it had 8/10 of the herbicidal rate of glyphosate in it. So that it was just going right through the chickens because it bioaccumulates in the plant, it bioaccumulates in us, in our brain, our bones, our heart and liver and other organisms. There's no cell in your body that won't accumulate glyphosate. And so it was just moving through the animal in that manure, and we were just processing it essentially, but you need to know what's in it. But we can use all of these materials as a resource. In China, on a project where one of their lakes, where they were trying to clean it up, did it with aquatic plants, 2 or 3 aquatic plants, and they were pulling enough manganese and cadmium and mercury out of it with the plant accumulation, get the accumulators, that they were actually harvesting the plants and drying them and then processing out the minerals for industrial use again. It's a matter of saying, okay, this is what the concern is, let's address it. People tell us you can't farm without glyphosate. What do we do without Roundup? How are we going to meet the needs of the world's growing population? Well, I can tell you what we did in Guatemala because I've been involved in that project now for 5 years. We were very concerned about end-stage kidney failure. 20,000 sugarcane workers died from end-stage kidney failure in Nicaragua and Panama last year. You have 1/4 of the population of sugarcane workers in El Salvador that are anticipated to die this year from end-stage kidney failure from glyphosate exposure. Glyphosate chelates the minerals. Kidney can't handle it. It plugs it up. We said 3 years ago, worked with the mill and said, you've got to get it out of here because pretty soon you're going to run out of people. And that's what's happening. You're changing the demographics and the whole works. And they said, well, how do we do it? We need it as a ripener. We get 0.3% more sugar when they use glyphosate because it shuts down tiller growth that never quite develops the sugar. So you just process a lot of biomass without getting anything out of it. And so we said, let's look at it for the purpose that you're growing the sugar cane, and that's to produce sugar. You're not growing the sugar cane to kill it with glyphosate. You can get 8 to 10 crops off of one planting. And started looking at it then from a production standpoint. 2 years ago, we got 150,000 acres, 64 hectare, for one meal off of glyphosate. We did it by using nutrition. We have a little bit of boron, a little bit of molybdenum, a little bit of manganese. Spray that on a month before harvest. This year, this is the second year, we produced 31,000 ton more refined sugar at 8% less cost, input cost, by getting rid of glyphosate. Next year, it'll be even better because you have that ratoon crop that isn't damaged by the glyphosate. Work in California, consult there. Pierce's disease, an extremely difficult disease to handle normally. Get rid of the glyphosate, go in with alternative weed management program, do some cover cropping. The grower got 20 cents a pound more for his grapes because of higher brick levels and nutrient value than his neighbor who keeps on the conventional program.
So I was wondering, thank you so much for...
We've got to look outside the box, but we can do it.
I would like to bring it back to maybe some of the policy analysts there, because we have some ideas. What is your view on this?
Well, I was just going to ask a question of Don. What does a post-glyphosate world look like for crop production, for row crop production? Because dicamba, like the next generation, isn't much better. In fact, it's worse. So what are you thinking about, when you're talking about corn and soy production? What do you see as a practical solution for the current widespread use of glyphosate?
Well, you can't keep doing the same thing that got you in the hole to start with and expect to have a different return, and that's what we see with dicamba. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but we've added, when you look at genetic engineering, you also have to look at what's the toxicity of all of those new proteins that are produced that nobody wants to talk about, because you have all the epigenetic effects from that genetic modification. So, but what we have, the genetic engineering for dicamba is the same type of thing as glyphosate, just lets you put the toxin right in your food. And so now we have not just glyphosate, but we have dicamba, we have 2,4-D, we have glufosinate, and they're working on a couple of others for genetically engineering, so that toxicity-wise, we're just accelerating the toxicity. But as far as weed control comes into play, those techniques are very limited anyway, because we know we have weeds resistant to all of them. So they're not effective as an herbicide. But we've always had an alternative. How did we control weeds 50 years ago or 40 years ago? One of the problems is that no-till has become a religion for us rather than a tool. Tillage is still a very effective tool for us. We went monoculture rather than crop rotation, which is a tremendous weed control process. All kinds of things. In Brazil, when they switched to the non-GMO non-Roundup ready soybeans, their yields went up 16%. There's always a yield drag to the GMO.
I think we have a question in the back.
Well, this is very informative and yet quite depressing. So can you give us, all of you, maybe each one of you, give us a positive action that we can all take in and commit to, be it an organization to be involved with physically or financially, actions that we can take at home, something that we can leave here today that's a positive note.
So, good question, because that's really what we have to come out with. And I want to elaborate a little further on Don, because that's part of the answer to that. And that is that Don's been teaching it. I've been teaching it for a number of years. Michael McNeil has, and a number of others. With appropriate nutrition, you asked what the next generation is on the Roundup Ready things. The biggest lie that you need to understand is that we do not have a genetics problem in our crops. It is not needed to genetically engineer crops to feed the world. That is the lie. We only produce now, and Don has told me this several times, we only produce now 5 to 10% of the genetic potential of the crops we already have. It's about nutritional management. And so every time that you buy into this belief that, like the Gates Foundation pushing golden rice in Africa because that's going to save the African children from blindness because it's going to give them vitamin A in the rice that doesn't have it, that's baloney. We don't have a genetics problem in our crops. We have a nutritional problem in our crops.
So Arden, if I can bring him back.
Yes, but So the first thing you have to do is you vote with your dollars. So you buy clean products. So that's your first answer. You buy clean products because your demand determines what industry is going to produce.
And then the other panelists, can they please answer it? Thank you.
You have to, I think, become more astute at following the political structure, which is a real pain because it is such an obscure and highly lied group of data. But industry, for example, is exempt after it puts its trash down the sewer. It's exempt. If it put that trash in a 55-gallon drum and took it to a dump, it would own it for the rest of the world's life and be responsible legally. So it immediately gets rid of its legal liability by sewering something. That's just one example. And that all that heavy metal, all that industrial waste, all of that from the big cities that they want to get rid of, then is transferred to the sewage liability, which evaporates. So you have to be aware of what is going on and why it's going on. You follow the dollar.
Follow the dollar, but is there an organization or just one website that we can rely on that honestly can give us help and advice? I mean, because when you go on the darn web, you get lost. And can you just give us one that we all can write down and take home with us?
How about Beyond Pesticides? Is that what you're looking for?
Maybe that's it. I don't know.
EWG, I think, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our farmer there?
What is something positive or something that...
Give us action. Give us so we can take home and share with others and do.
Right. So I think one very obvious thing is that you can find farms and producers that are employing good practices. A shorthand for that at least on our farm, is organic, but that's not everything, and I'm just going to say that. It's complicated, and organic is not just or biodynamic. We have some biodynamic farmers in the room too. It's not everything, but it's important, and it's a shorthand, and it is also a certification. Organic is not a word that can be used loosely. It's actually something that's regulated by USDA. But I think that there is positive change. There are young people, there are farmers all across the country who are taking action and are listening to good advice and are trying to incorporate the best practices on their operations. And it's up to consumers to seek them out and support them financially so they can continue to do that. Because I can tell you from firsthand experience on our farm and other farms, those farms that are trying to do everything right, from paying their workers, safeguarding their workers, using practices that are more natural, they require more labor, they're more expensive, and there is significant downward pressure on what we can charge for our food, right, from all of you. And to do it right is more expensive, at least for the small-scale farmer. And so being willing to invest in your food and recognize the nutrition that you're getting from that food, maybe the healthcare expenses that you're saving down the road, that is really important. So find your local producers, take stock of what they're doing, and support them. But I think the other thing along those lines is these political campaigns, consumer-driven campaigns around antibiotics have been impactful, right? We have seen over the last year, major fast food chains, Chick-fil-A just, I guess, became another chain that is zero antibiotics with their chicken. That's great. They wouldn't have done that on their own, right? It's because consumers are saying, this is important, we demand this. These antibiotics are too important to be using and abusing in our poultry like this. There are also some new regulations as well.
And
so keep it up.
I would like to add also, so we talk a lot about things that we can do, right? So we talk a lot about using our money, but unfortunately money is not equally distributed among people. So not everybody in this room here has the same number of voices when it comes to use money. So to try to go around that is also like you can write to your Congress people. I know we actually talk a lot about politics, but Congress tried to ban the use of antibiotics in agriculture 4 times or 5 times, if I recall properly. 3 times by the Democratic Party, 2 times by the Republican Party. So they clearly agree that is a thing that we should stop doing, but we always disagree with each other. So that we're one of the only countries that still allow the use of antibiotics for growth promotion in agriculture. So,
well,
but the reason what I want to say here is that, so if you think about climate change as an example, climate change, we managed to actually make government moves. I mean, people would agree that they're not moving enough, but we have enough evidences now in the scientific community to come together and say, we really have to care about this. And I think here what we hear is that there's enough scientific evidence. There's a consensus here that antibiotic pollution and pharmaceutical pollution is actually a real issue. And I think if we start making sure that our government knows we care about this, maybe there will be some movement. And that's not just about our science.
As an alternative, there are a lot of alternatives also in the mill that are going to be there. If you're looking for a chemical, you're probably not going to find one that's going to be as cheap and as inclusive as glyphosate. But there are much better materials. There's some vinegar that have been out for a long time with some detergent effective against some weeds, but what happened with glyphosate is it shut down all the research because it took the entire market share. So that we haven't had any real research for 30 years until just recently, last 5 years with the weed resistance. Now a lot of companies have said, hey, this product's going to go out the window. It's not like it was going to last forever. We're seeing a lot of research and new products now that are coming. I think for your own purposes, we're seeing a lot more cover cropping. Cover cropping has, for the organics, you use it for nutrition. but it also for weed control. And we see that if we'll move that over into conventional operations, we can also get many of those same benefits. And
would you consider hemp a good cover crop to use now, since it does sequester quite a bit of carbon from the atmosphere, and it can be harvested twice a year, and it has multiple uses from industrial, from buildings to fabrics, etc. And it was used in the 1800s anyway.
Depending on where you are, but there are many alternatives. It's just that we took the easiest one, the simplest one, and in many cases the cheapest one, but not the best one.
All right, so thank you, Carla. You had a question for a while now, I think.
I just have a comment to give you a little bit of hope. Because in the field of the microbiome, there are a lot of innovators in soil and environmental research using microbes, which, earlier on I said, microbes transform everything. And you can use them for bioremediation. They helped clean up the oil spills. And so part of making any kind of transition is replenishing the life of the soil through the microbes, and there's a lot of research, and there are a lot of innovative companies that are looking at putting the microbes back in the soil that can clean up the problems. And I'm not saying that's going to be a miracle sudden answer, but it is on the forefront of using.
We're going to go in the back and then in the front here again.
Oh, yes.
Well, so I think we have an answer here from a previous question. So I think Alistair. Yeah.
It was the one at the back about what would you the positive actions. Now, so I think I guess on the positive side, from what we found, the monitoring campaigns that we have data for to date, I think it's about 95 or something. 41 of those, the levels of antibiotics were pretty low. Much lower than these limits that have been proposed, which is good news, which I think shows that we do have. I mean, even excluding the Australia example where it's going out to sea, we do have situations where we're managing our waste and wastewater properly, and we're treating it properly. So Switzerland, for example, have very, very good infrastructure. They've now put what's called tertiary treatment onto every wastewater treatment plant to strip out all of these antibiotics and other molecules. And they've noticed a big improvement in water quality. So we have we do have the technical solutions. We've talked about glyphosate in drinking water here, I think. In Europe, we're not allowed anywhere near what you guys are allowed in our drinking water. We're allowed 100 nanograms per litre of any pesticide. And if it's above that, that water is regarded as unsafe. So again, there's the technical solutions to treat out these molecules. And I think in a country like the US, it's amazing that you're not employing these. And then in terms of what you can do, and this is what I tell my students, and I'm not sure whether you can do this in the States, but in the UK, if we have waste medicines, we can take it back to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist will dispose of it properly, whereas most people just throw it down the toilet or into the bin. So what you could do is take any unused medicines back to the pharmacist. That would be a start.
Can I just... I just wanted to make one comment, please. In response to your comment, there's a growing movement called One Health. One Health is the simple concept that human, animal, and environmental health are linked. And it is recognized by the CDC, the World Health Organization, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health. Largely recognized by the veterinarians, they get it because they recognize that their patients, all the animals, are in the environment. With human medicine, it's been a much harder nut to crack because the docs just see their patients in their clinics and they don't think of them as being in an environment. So it is a professional movement, mostly veterinarians, some physicians, such as myself, some environmental health people, but to get it out to the public has been a real challenge. So please visit these websites, onehealthinitiative.com, the onehealthcommission.org. There's a European One Health platform. There's a number, just Google One Health, and a whole bunch of things will come up. But we would love to get the public engaged in this because it is so important, because we just focus on humans. We're not focusing on the big picture, and I'll be talking about this more later today.
All right, so I would like to come back, and we had an interesting question for like things we can do actively, and then maybe one more question before we go for lunch here at the back. So, gentleman has been had his hand for a little while, but can you just?
I just wanted to add to the conversation about what we can do. I would advocate each and every one of us to go home today and figure out, where does your poop go? And where does your poop go? You know that story, there's a storybook that all of my kids have read, maybe yours has too, which is about everybody poops. We all can do something about this today by finding out, where is your waste going? Do you have a septic tank, or does it go to a treatment plant? Both of those outcomes, both of those places where your waste is going, have a big impact on your local environment, particularly whether or not that system is working. And so there are many things that we can do immediately to be sure that we're not contributing to the issues that we're talking about. The other thing that I would advocate for is getting involved, and there are many different ways here in the Hudson Valley in particular, in looking at water quality. In your hometown, in your backyard, there are many ways to do that. And we can take a look. We can actually, if you partner with the many institutions up and down the Hudson Valley, you can find out, is there glyphosate in my water? Is there an issue of nutrients coming down the waterway in my backyard? What are the ways that I just need enough information to be able to be a part of changing some of these really big issues? Because I know it can be very overwhelming. This can feel overwhelming and a little bit depressing. But the thing is that on the local level, if we can figure out ways on a local level to take care of these issues, we can model it for the global, model it so that we can take it to the global level. But we don't have answers yet. It takes scientists, it takes community members, it takes all the people on that panel to figure these things out, and we can start doing that here. And many of us are. So but I do, go home, figure out, where does your waste go. It'll lead you down a very exciting pathway. Kind of stinky, but exciting.
All right, thank you. I think.
The Organic Consumers Association, and they have expanded what they've been doing lately with their funding and their outreach programs. The other thing that we can do, and I tell my patients to do, is to start opening these conversations at the dinner table with family members that may not be totally, not only not educated about it, but also not receptive. We have to have the courage to say, this is why I am consuming this organic produce or this organic beef. This is why. And if we do that, and they do that, and it keeps flowing from one person to another, that's how these movements have gotten going since the late 1960s.
I would take two.
One of you, when you go home, to invite friends that you know who don't understand what we've been learning today here, and going further with it, and discussing and opening their thought process and their minds, and sharing information with them.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Not go to the same old that do believe in it and who are active.
So I'll take a final question, and maybe then we can open the floor for final comments before we go for lunch, okay? So,
just to get back to how to dispose safely of any drugs at home, there's a long-held myth that if you put it in coffee grounds and you put it in the trash, if you don't live near a pharmacy, what do you do to safely get rid of your drugs?
Yeah, so it's getting back to the comment we had a moment ago, actually, about understanding where your waste goes. So the worst thing to do is probably to put it down the toilet. That would be the worst thing to do. If your waste goes to landfill, that's probably the next best thing to do, because particularly if your landfill's lined, you're probably not going to get migration from the landfill to the environment. But again, it's understanding what happens to your waste and how that's managed.
What does the pharmacy do?
So the pharmacy will dispose of it as hazardous waste. So they will usually send it to a hazardous waste incinerator, where it will be burned at about 1600 degrees.
Can a average citizen send something to a biohazard waste plant?
Well, in Europe they're really expensive, so it's probably something that you wouldn't do. But in the UK, our pharmacists have to accept the waste. So most, everyone is probably within 10 miles of a pharmacist. So when they go shopping, they can just drop it at the pharmacist. And the pharmacists have to do it. They have to accept the waste. So I can get medicines from somewhere else and go to another pharmacist, and they'll have to accept it, and then they will pay for it to be disposed of. But I don't think you'd do it as a citizen, because it'd probably be a bit too expensive.
You don't want to do that, because you own it forever and all the liability. So if the dump that they use 10 years down the line gets an order to be cleaned up because it's now a Superfund site, you're going to share in the immense cost of that because your name's there. That's the beauty of being able to put it in a sewer for industry, because the moment it goes into a sewer, the liability disappears. And that's why that law is on the books. So it's all very complicated. But one of the things that, getting back to the gentleman on poop, find out where the poop goes. Okay, there's solids that are coming off. The water is separated and the solids are consolidated. New York puts it in a train. It goes to Texas, where it goes on farms. It's that complicated. It's not an easy process. Nobody wants it. It's horribly expensive to get rid of. It's terribly damaging to the soil. And it carries antibiotic resistance in megatons. 70% or so of the U.S. sewage sludge goes on land. It's nuts.
So I have to disagree with that. It's the idea of putting it down the sewer rather than landfill. To put drugs down the sewer is, that's really bad. Particularly some drugs, like the contraceptive pill, is incredibly toxic to fish. Forgetting the liability, no one's going to chase you 20 years down the line because your pack of pills has gone into a landfill site. So, I have to disagree with that.
I'm not advocating putting it as. I'm saying that's reality.
Yeah, so just like the reality of why the industry will dispose of water. I think we have lots of questions. I think it's a good. Go ahead, Emily.
There is a pickup. Take that day on October 26th. Yeah. So Google it, or just ask your local police.
One more. Okay.
One last short question.
Okay, one last short question.
I have a question for panelists. People who are sitting next to me. We've been talking a lot about antibiotics. I'm also interested in fungicides and the broad spread use of fungicides on crops, and how those are creating a parallel problem and related problem to antibiotics.
No question, if I could answer.
Yeah.
And
let's make
that. No question, it's becoming a problem. And when our herbicide use went down, our fungicide use went up because of the increased susceptibility of the genetically engineered. So we just changed one poison for another. on the area. But how many of you have seen a weed growing under a black walnut tree? There's a principle there of allelopathy, natural disease suppression. I used to take 10 or 12 50-gallon drums from Indiana to Maryland every year to an asparagus grower, because that was his weed control. All he had to do was take those husks off the husk and the leaves from black walnut. Asparagus, one of the few plants that can tolerate it very well, and he had excellent weed control on his asparagus. He didn't have to use the chemicals. Charles Tye, our biochemical geneticist at Purdue for years, went into the germplasm lines and started selecting for allelopathy in corn that would suppress the growth of giant ragweed and foxtail. And he had lines that would do that. We could do it all, but we've abandoned the land grant system, and no commercial enterprise is ever going to do it because you can't patent it. And we need to get back from a regulatory standpoint or a government standpoint to recognize some of these priorities, because these are longer-term projects, and they're not going to be commercially viable because you can't patent. But the technique's all there. The knowledge is there. It's a matter of getting it done and having the incentive and the priority.
Right. I want to thank this panel for increasing our knowledge greatly about soil and water. We're gonna break for lunch. Lunch is right outside. Just go straight.